we can get started now just to respect everyone's time. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final workshop, family workshop of this school year. It's hard to believe that it's the end of the school year almost. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the NYU Nest Family Workshop welcomes families from across the Nest program to build community and share practical supports and strategies together. So each workshop will include a presentation, Q&A, and opportunities for families to share your unique experiences and helpful strategies. So this is our last webinar of this school year, and those of you who have been on this ride with us, you know that on our last workshops of the school year, we invite autistic self-advocates to share their lived experience with us, either Nest graduates or autistic speakers and practitioners from whom we can learn a lot, and they can teach us as the true experts of the autism experience. So my name is Yalda Heshmati. It is pronounced Y-A-L-D-A. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an instructional support consultant at the Nest Support Project. And I am here with my co-facilitator, Dr. Michelle Lee, who is also, her video is on. Do you want to say hi, Michelle?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Michelle Lee. Pronouns are she, her. And I have the pleasure of co-facilitating these workshops with Yalda and also working with the NYU Nest Support Project.
Awesome. Thank you. So just very quickly, some notes on accessibility. Today's session is recorded for future viewing. Actually, each of the sessions are always recorded, and it is closed captioned. You can enable or disable that by just clicking on the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom screen on the panel. And since this is a webinar with a lot of participants, all participants' cameras and mics are turned off. So there are two ways that you can engage with us. One way is to use the chat, which you can do so throughout the session. You can write your comments, ask questions, etc. And the second way is through the Q&A function on Zoom. And usually participants have used this feature for those overall big questions. So without further ado, actually, I forgot to mention, I will also share a link to evaluation at the end of this webinar, and we really appreciate that you give us feedback so we can make our workshops to better meet our families' needs. So yes, and I am so excited to introduce to you our speaker for today, Hani Schneider. Their pronouns are they, them. Actually, Hani has collaborated with the Nest team on different projects and has helped us in development of projects, has facilitated project workshops for Nest practitioners, as well as working directly with the Nest schools. And I can just say that I personally have learned a lot from them, and I continue to learn from them by following their work online and listening to them speak at different events and on different podcasts episodes. And I really appreciate that you're here with us, Hani. This is just a very brief introduction. I'm just going to read from it, but then I'll let you introduce yourself. So Hani is a multidisciplinary artist, licensed mental health counselor, consultant, and facilitator whose work highlights and is rooted in the intersections of disability, gender, and mental health. So Hani, the floor is yours. I'm going to stop share now so you can share with us your screen.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. That about says it. I mean, I do a lot of different stuff because I could never really seem to kind of just stick to one thing. And I've been able to very fortunately sort of hobble together a very interesting life for myself, doing lots of different types of work. I'm gonna go ahead and get this slideshow started. I do want to give you a heads up, there's animations on it. I tried really hard to get it to not be moving around so much, but I couldn't quite figure it out. Hopefully that won't be an issue for anyone, but if it is, I do understand. I'll have a bit of a PDF handout to send y'all along with all of this information and everything. So I'm gonna go ahead and get ready to present here for you. All right. Well, that was awkward. Today we're going to be just talking about kind of navigating like adolescence, right? We're going to talk a little bit about sexuality. We're going to talk a little bit about gender. And we're going to kind of get into these kind of sensitive topics that come up for families quite a bit. You might be wondering, well, why? But first, let's go over kind of just the run of the show tonight. We're just going to kind of talk broadly adolescence and kind of what that can be like from an autistic perspective. I'm going to share a little bit about my personal experience, and then kind of touch a little bit on just some foundations for kind of talking about and thinking about, especially as parents, navigating sexuality and navigating gender stuff that might come up with your child, or just within your family. I have kind of a lot of content to get through, so, and I don't like feeling like I'm talking to myself for 90 minutes. So please, I encourage you to jump in the chat, and I'm going to try to address questions as they come up. I can see it here in the corner of my screen. So if you have questions, if you have comments, I'd love to have y'all participate as much as you'd like to through that feature. And I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. But yeah, I'm Honey. I'm a consultant and an educator. I'm not doing a whole lot of licensed therapy right now, but I'm doing some peer coaching, which has been very fulfilling. I offer like short kind of consultations to families, to parents, particularly around like some gender stuff that can come up. That's usually the place that we go with it. And I'm also an artist, which is quite nice. Oh, actually, sorry. You might be wondering why me specifically, why I'm talking about this. I got the triple whammy growing up. I grew up a young person, pre-Reddit, pre-TikTok, pre-Instagram, pre basically any way of learning anything on the internet. We had dial-up, didn't have a computer for a long time. And I also grew up autistic and trans, and none of us knew it at the time. So it was a very weird time. Had a lot of difficult things happen to me in my life, a lot of really challenging things come up for me and my family. And that kind of put me on a bit of a trajectory to really try to figure out kind of why I was the way that I was, which also put me on a trajectory for getting into mental health and wanting to support peers and families and all of that. So adolescence, what a time, it's a pretty weird time for everyone, I would say. But when it comes to being autistic, I think sometimes, it can hit a little bit different. And again, I find all kinds of families struggling with all kinds of different things. And some of the work that I've done in schools, I noticed that there's just extra layers to a lot of the different things that come up in adolescence that a lot of autistic kids can really struggle with, and also struggle to know where to find support around these things. So with adolescence, it brings a lot of different things, right? So as we get older, moving into upper grades of elementary school, middle school especially can be really tough. High school, there comes more social pressure to fit in, more nuanced and coded social atmospheres that can get a lot less direct. New relational expectations that come up, whether that's dating or the ways that adolescents have to take on more responsibility for themselves, for their actions, etc. Greater self-awareness, and also in many ways self-consciousness. So I have a question here. Is this for self-advocacy? In some ways, this is largely going to kind of be for parents, more so, and going to be more about kind of how to navigate some of these topics, or things that you might want to think about when navigating these topics within your family, and particularly with your autistic child. So this is less going to be about like speaking to autistic folks specifically about self-advocating, and more about kind of the family side of things. I'm not an ASD Nest alumni, but I am an alumni of NYU, and that's how I got connected with the Nest program. And so I do quite a bit of work with them. Yeah, thanks for asking. So again, adolescence, right? It's like hormones are changing, bodies are changing, social expectations are changing, schools are changing, a lot of things are coming up. But a lot of times for autistic folks, like some of the hormonal changes and some of these like shifts can be like much more intense. So like I've known a lot of folks who have gone through more heightened sensory experiences and whose like kind of profiles of some autistic traits can feel a bit more intense during certain parts of like puberty. Um, I've also met quite a few trans people who have experienced like some shifts in sensory profiles when they're taking HRT, so hormone replacement therapy. And that's something that kind of came up for me later in my life. For a lot of autistic adolescents, I find that like emotional experiences can be a bit deeper and a bit more intense than some of their holistic counterparts, or kind of impact them longer, or in larger ways. Um, Also, a lot of times I've spoken to a lot of autistic folks who have really struggled with sleep throughout their lives, but where during adolescence, again, it got like significantly worse. Um, and that can also include like just higher levels of stress in general, both because of some of the like body changes that are happening, but also primarily because of a lot of social changes that are happening. And like, I'll say for myself, change has historically been very difficult in my life and is very stressful. So navigating that and all the different layers of it throughout adolescence was a very stressful experience to me. And I'm going to speak more on that as we keep going here. Particularly, and I think it's really important to note, and this is not to like scare anybody or to like, start on such a negative note, but just because I think it's something that's important to be aware of, is that all of these things, depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, are significantly more prevalent for autistic folks. I had all of those things. I started the eating disorder one because I developed an eating disorder that was extremely severe when I was like 12, 13 years old, to the point where I was hospitalized for quite a long time. And I was taken out of the 8th grade for like 2 months to really just focus on like recovery. Um, and at the time, I didn't quite understand what was going on or why it was going on in the ways that it was. But when I've thought back on it and I've analyzed the situation, I noticed that like a lot of it had to do with like gender stuff for me, changes that were going on in my body that I was deeply uncomfortable with, but didn't really consciously know or necessarily know how to like cope with or even talk about. In part because I didn't have examples of any idea that my gender could be different when I was younger. Um, I also, a lot of it was around some of the shifts and changes in social dynamics and school changes, and just the difficulty that I had with like shifting from elementary school and my familiarity of that school, like the hallways, where everything was, who the teachers were, the environment, the students that were there, into middle school, where I have to relearn all of those things. And there's more complicated social dynamics. And I have to meet a whole bunch of new other students. And in many ways, for me, the eating disorder was like a means that's seeking safety through seeking control. And food is something I've always been picky about. So it kind of was a natural place for me to kind of struggle when I look back. But because we didn't know that I was on the spectrum and we didn't know that I was trans, I was institutionalized in a space that really kind of did the opposite of support me and ended up being a very traumatic experience for me. And that's because I was being treated as if I was allistic. And so I was not responding, quote unquote, to treatments that were happening. So my case is a bit specific in that regard, because we didn't have a diagnosis for me. So it took a lot of backtracking to understand what had happened. So we have a question: how would one recognize signs that therapies are necessary? And that's a great question. I think, ultimately you're going to know your child best. So I would say look for shifts and changes in behavior. You don't have to be hyper vigilant about it. You don't have to be like, okay, like, oh God, something changed. Like it's a problem, but just pay attention, and if you're noticing that they're struggling more with certain daily living skills, or they're not showing as much interest in things that they typically would, that could be maybe a sign of depression. If they're sleeping more, right? Some adolescents just generally sleep more because they need it more, but pay attention. You know your kid best, and you'll know if something is off. And at that point, hopefully you have some supports around, whether it's a school counselor or a teacher or other folks that are maybe support folks, a physician in your kid's life who you could lean on and say, okay, do we think it's time to get more support? Thanks, Helen, for the comment about the difficulty of growing up and the appreciation. Thank you. Yeah, weird times in the 90s, you know? We didn't know what we didn't know. Okay, so bad things can happen in adolescence. It's terrifying and tricky, right? And adolescence is a really important opportunity to help kids learn a sense of autonomy. It's a great time for opportunities for social connection, for self-discovery, for self-actualization, and figuring out who we want to be in the world. And I believe that all autistic people deserve all of those opportunities as much as possible. And so with that, right, it's like, how do we kind of balance these things? How do we stay aware of the fact that adolescence is a bit harder while also making sure that these opportunities are available and that they can fully live out these opportunities of their adolescence if they so desire? In general, there's some building blocks that I like to recommend to people, and these are building blocks that can start at a very young age. You know, you can start talking about some of these things with 3, 4, 5-year-olds if you want to, and the building blocks starting young is great because they build to being able to have more specific conversations around sex, around gender, around boundaries. So one of them is consent, and a great example of this for a young person is just like, can I give you a kiss? Can I give you a hug? Modeling for them, asking first, right? Reminding them that you need to ask someone before you're going to kiss them, right? Before you're going to hug them. And you can parse that out in your family in terms of which things feel on the more intimate side and which don't. And you can also help them understand, like, what does it mean to ask for what you want? And when is it maybe inappropriate when someone's not asking and they're just doing something to you that doesn't feel comfortable? And again, that can start as basic as like asking for hugs, reminding kids that like people have to ask before they hug them. Very basic consent stuff, but that can lead to, when your kid's a teenager, consent when it comes to other types of boundaries they might want to include in their life with their friends, with potential romantic interests, with employers, right? Privacy and private spaces also, starting again young with how do we just kind of start to distinguish, like giving you a sense of privacy, because that builds to autonomy, right? And I find that like in the world of disability and like autism stuff, sometimes like adolescents aren't really afforded a lot of privacy, or they're not necessarily trusted with the privacy that they're given. So this is something where, again, you can start small, start with like in your home. What spaces are kind of private spaces, right? Like your bedroom, like that's your space, right? And you can have boundaries around who is allowed to come in and when they're allowed to come in. And we can talk about that as a family or parent to child. The bathroom, a private space, right? What spaces maybe are not so private. And then later down the line, you can also talk about things like, you know, masturbation, like things that are normal for teenagers, but sometimes for autistic folks, it can be a little bit harder to distinguish, okay, where is this appropriate? When is this appropriate? How do I want to do this? So this is something that kind of build a foundation for getting to those harder conversations later and making those harder conversations, or more, not necessarily harder, more complex conversations a bit easier. Two other big ones are like gauging trustworthiness and identifying trusted adults. It's unfortunately true that autistic folks are more likely to be sexually assaulted. They are more likely to be taken advantage of. We are, rather, I should say. And that's something I experienced a lot in my adolescence. I'm not going to get into all of the different things that I experienced, but because I grew up in a household that was in a school and in a community that was teaching abstinence only education, there was no room for nuanced conversation. It was just, there was a lot of shame around talking about like sex and sexuality. There wasn't really conversations around gender. It was very much like, you do this thing when you get married and otherwise you don't do it. And because there was no in between and there was no one talking with me about boundaries, helping me understand my own boundaries in my own body, helping me understand what is trustworthy behavior from other people, especially older people, I ended up being in a lot of situations where I didn't even know what was happening to me or what was going on until it was over. And then after the situation, I didn't really have anyone that I could speak to because my family also was kind of very avoidant of these topics, and there was a lot of shame around these topics. So I didn't really have a safe place to go. Starting to kind of identify again, like, what's a good friend? How do you know you can trust your friend with your young child helps, again, build these conversations around when you're interested in dating someone, when you're interested in seeking out romantic relationships. How do we know that this person is trustworthy? We touched on boundaries a little bit, right? Kind of starting small, helping a kid identify, do you like getting hugs or not? If a kid is like, I don't really like those, respecting that boundary and also helping them learn how to communicate, even when maybe a family member comes in for a hug without asking, helping that kid remember, like, oh, I'm allowed to say, like, no thanks. I'll give you a high five. I'll give you a fist bump. So starting again, you can start as young as you want. Um, and also normalizing sexual behaviors, sexuality. And it doesn't mean talking about it all the time. It doesn't mean sharing information before your kid is developmentally ready. It just means being willing to say, yeah, having those feelings sometimes is normal. And that's something that comes up for teenagers. That's something that comes up for someone your age, right? Being able to just kind of speak about these things from a more neutral space. These can be really big building blocks all throughout youth, throughout adolescence, throughout young adulthood. And these are things that you can always come back to. Okay. So a big part of growing up is coming into one's own sexuality. And I kind of struggled with this topic because I find that a lot of times parents don't want to necessarily acknowledge or admit that kids are typically happening upon this information whether or not they want them to. References to sex, things about sex are in media everywhere. Kids are on social media. It's out in our world. And so it's just generally true that exposure to sexual themes like increases with age and the proliferation of social media and technology, right? So whether or not you're comfortable with it, parents, and whether or not you think your kid is ready or thinking about sex, the truth is that they've likely already been exposed to like bits and pieces of information, a lot of which is probably also stereotyped or inaccurate. And it's probably through media and possibly peers. So it's like, how much information are they really getting? But they are probably being exposed to it. So it's never really too early to start like developmentally appropriate dialogue about this topic. Um, one of the one of the ways that ableism functions is in perpetuating the belief that like disabled folks don't have sex or connect to sexuality. And that's also one of the reasons that I kind of struggled with bringing this topic in. Um, I tend to see this in the world of like autism in a couple different ways. One, I think many parents can feel quite shocked and uncertain when their child starts expressing interest in sex or behaving in sexual ways. And they can typically tend to shame or like shut down their child or like panic themselves. And then the child sort of sees that panic and learns that like, okay, this behavior maybe is shameful or isn't good. And that, I mean, that happens for adults of autistic kids as well. The second way is that many parents assume that their autistic child isn't interested in sex, and or they won't have a sex life or even a sexual or sensual relationship with themselves. Like that's just an assumption that's often made. And then three is that many parents assume that their child will develop these interests much later in life. So it's best to like wait until later in life, or like they don't really feel the need to like start a dialogue about it. So the good news is that even if you fall into like any one of these categories even a little bit, or you're just kind of like struggling with this topic in general, there are lots of things you can kind of consider. And it's, again, never too late to really start talking about it. And it's not really too early either if you think about some of those building blocks that we talked about. Again, I grew up in an abstinence only sort of very shameful Midwestern community. And I was taught that sex was basically for procreation and very little else. And so I think as most of us know, it's not just about that. And for a lot of autistic people and allistic people, but I know a lot of autistic people that are into like different kink type themes for a lot of different reasons. And it mostly has to do with sensory stuff. So for a lot of people, sex is about autonomy. It's about like body autonomy, self-discovery in that way. Sometimes sex is about gender affirmation. Sometimes it's about coping, right? Like it can feel good and it can be a way of shifting how we feel in our body physiologically. It can be, oh, I put self-discovery twice. It's really about that. It can be about relationship. It can be about joy and play. It can be about sensory stuff, sensuality, pleasure, connection with self, connection with others, right? So there's so much of a way that sensuality and sexuality can play into people's lives. And as adolescents, this is like a new thing that is emerging. I want to encourage people not to shy away from thinking about it and talking about it. This is the area where I find that a lot of parents struggle. And again, not just parents of autistic folks, but like parents in general. I know my parents did. I think I remember my mom. When I was younger, all my friends were getting these things we called triangle bras, and they were just like training bras with just like a triangle piece of fabric that was really not going to do much to support you. But we're like 10, 11, 12 years old. My friends are getting these like triangle bras. And so of course I'm like, I have to have a triangle bra. I must have one. I will not rest until I have one. So I'm hounding my mom about it. She finally gets me one. We never talk about it again. And then like a little bit later, after I start asking about shaving my legs, because all my friends are shaving their legs, even though I don't really understand the purpose of shaving your legs, she never has a conversation with me, but she leaves the book Our Bodies Ourselves on my bed one afternoon. And I got home from school and it was on my bed, but we never talked about it. So I just want to encourage y'all to do a little bit better by your kids in terms of having these more open conversations and showing them that you're someone who's available to them for these conversations. And so some tips for that: get really clear on your goals for why do I want to have a conversation about XYZ? Why do I want to have a conversation about sex with my child? Why do I want to have a conversation about consent with my child? Why do I want to have a conversation about boundaries? And I'll have a slide after this that gets into that a little bit more. Be specific as well. When I say that, what I mean is my experience of being autistic is that my mind is very good at filling in blanks and coming up with information and or coming up with a lot of questions where I don't have enough information. And when I was growing up, because I got very small little bits of information here and there, partially about dating, about kissing, about sex, whatever it might have been, I was just very ill-informed, and I really didn't know that I even could ask more questions. I didn't know where to go to ask more questions. I didn't even really know that I should be asking more questions. I just kind of took what I was hearing as like, okay, I guess that's what it is. So being specific can be really, really helpful. It doesn't mean being overly detailed if it's not appropriate for your child and where they're at. But you can be specific. So with that, again, it's like getting very specific with them on what is an appropriate hug and what is an inappropriate hug, right? If someone's coming in to hug you, are they hugging you for a quick, brief hug, or are they holding on longer than maybe you are comfortable with or than what might be comfortable? Being very, very specific about what that could look like, and using social stories is a great way to do that. And typically I find that with adolescents, they have things that are happening in their life already that can bring up questions around how can I navigate this? And so leaning into those things that are already happening and getting into the specifics of it can be really, really helpful. A question from Andrew: do you have resources, books to guide the discussion with young children? I do have resources. I'm not like quoting them on the slides or anything, but in the PDF handout that I'm going to send out, there's going to be like a whole long list of some YouTube videos you can watch, some articles, and some books as well that could be helpful so that you can get more information. Excuse me. Another big one is be honest. I think sometimes it can be difficult to be honest about these things when we have our own shame around it. It can be difficult to speak honestly about it. And also sometimes it can be easy to want to like dilute the truth a little bit. But even if you don't know the answer to something, being honest about that is going to be significantly better. And it's going to create an opportunity for you to say, you know what? I don't know. Let's look into it together. Or to say, you know what? I'm not sure. I'm going to do some research and I'm going to get back to you. And that also allows an opportunity for continued dialogue. It allows an opportunity for your child to know and see that you're putting an effort to like understand them and to want to talk with them about these things. Again, you can always deliver developmentally appropriate information without like sort of sugar coating it. We kind of already went over this, but keeping it simple to start. start with easy stuff that you can sort of build on as the child gets older, because I think it's very difficult when these conversations haven't been started and all of a sudden like a kid is 14, 15, 16 years old and has all these really complex questions about relating to their friends, asking a girl out, going on a date somewhere, having privacy even with a friend, what that could look like. And it's going to be a lot more difficult to kind of start those conversations without some building blocks. Again, this can be as starting as basic as like spaces that are private, basic types of touching and being close with one another. Even ways that we talk to people and things that are conversationally appropriate versus maybe not conversationally appropriate, and where certain conversations should or should not be happening. Another really big one is, I find this is particularly relevant for autistic folks, is like helping us understand why something matters. I was always the kid that was walking around being like, why? Like, why do you want me to do that thing? Like, why should I do that? Because the thing you're asking me to doesn't make any sense to me. And so I become very resistant to doing something if I didn't understand why. And this can be both sharing your why, because, right, you want to relate to your child and you can say, look, it's important to me because of XYZ thing. But again, my mom had plenty of her own whys for telling me different things or sharing different things or trying to get me to do certain things like brush my teeth twice a day. But I was like, your why is not the same as mine, so I don't care. Share your why, absolutely. And also try to understand, like, why, how do I help my kid connect to why this thing might matter, whether it's privacy, whether it's boundaries, whether it's toothbrushing and showering, combing their hair, like whatever it might be, especially if your child is struggling, connecting to a reason that it could matter to them specifically is really big, with getting something to kind of stick. Don't be afraid to be repetitive as well, especially with younger folks, but repetition, especially when it comes to things like, I'm always here for you. If you have questions, let me know. Repetition around, again, even like just to kind of keep with the same example to keep it working for you. Repetition around like asking before hugging them, especially as they get older maybe and become less comfortable with that. Repetition does not hurt. You might eventually get the teenager that's like, yeah, I know you've told me a million times. Then y'all can hash that out and have that conversation when that time comes. The last thing that I want people to keep in mind is something called dignity of risk. Some of you might have heard that, some maybe not, but dignity of risk is kind of like an idea that folks talk about in disability justice communities, disability rights communities. And the idea is that a lot of folks with disabilities are not given the dignity of risk. They're sort of like overprotected, not given a lot of privacy, again, not given opportunities to explore and take risks and experience different things in life because they're seen as like not able or not capable. What I think is really important is that for self-actualization, for anyone, any adolescent, to learn how to take care of themselves and their body, to learn how to navigate the world safely, having small opportunities where they can do that is important. But there are a lot of ways where having these conversations and putting these building blocks in place can help with harm reduction and can help reduce risk while also giving adolescents opportunities to actually lean into situations, right? Like I literally was just consulting with a parent who was like very, very stressed about their 16-year-old autistic child going out on a date and kept being like, well, I don't want them to be alone together anywhere. Like I like just was kind of going through their list of things that they were like afraid of and like did not want the child to necessarily do. And I kind of asked a few questions around why, like, why don't you want that? What are you afraid is going to happen? And as it had turned out, they hadn't had a lot of these conversations with their child yet. And so some of their fears were founded because they didn't actually really know what their child thought of certain things or how their child might navigate certain situations. So being able to have these also gives you an opportunity to feel like, okay, like if my child is going to go out and spend some time with friends or be out in the world and I'm not there, I feel comfortable that they're going to be able to advocate for themselves a bit because we've talked about things like boundaries, consent, etc. I want to touch on the what is your goal part because something I've learned in looking back at my own childhood growing up is that my parents were just really in their own feelings all the time, which is why they couldn't really support me around mine. And I think I love my parents and they did the best they could, certainly. Like, this is not a dig at them necessarily, but they didn't really have the support that they needed to unpack a lot of their own stuff. So when I had a lot of things coming up as a young person, a lot of what happened was whatever I was experiencing was actually sort of still within the family, centered around their emotional experience. And when I consult with parents, a lot of what I hear about is the parents' fear, the parents' concern, the parents' emotional experience that they haven't actually really unpacked. And I find that sometimes that can be the thing, again, that gets centered in the family over the child's autonomy, the child's dignity of taking risks, the child's ability to self-actualize. So think about your goal when you want to have a conversation about gender, sexuality, whatever with your child. Do a quick check-in with yourself. Like, where am I coming from? Like, am I trying to get my kid to do something? Do I want my kid to be able to develop more body autonomy? Do I want to help with harm reduction? Do I want to help prevent the fact that, like, again, a lot of I'll try to find a statistic for y'all, but like it's fairly common for autistic folks to be sexually assaulted. It's fairly common for autistic folks to end up in abusive relationships. So is your goal to help your child navigate those situations and not end up in them if possible without necessarily limiting them? Is your goal to help your child figure out how to take care of themselves and build those skills, right? Whether it's like hygiene and the things that come up with that during puberty, bedtimes, right? Being able to take care of their body when it comes to their own sense of gender, sexuality. Is your goal that like you hope that someday they can have a really fulfilling partnership? Whatever it might be, check in with yourself about that because that's also going to help inform you as to kind of how you want to address it with them. And it's also going to help check you. Like, is your goal to limit the child out of your own fear, or is it to support your child with something, whether it's one of these aspects or something else that's more relevant and meaningful to you? So gender, we're gonna switch gears a little bit here. We're gonna kind of go into gender and I'm gonna share a bit more about my experience as well with this. Folks can sort of come into their trans identity at any point in their life, certainly. I know plenty of very, very young folks who are like very clear on their gender identity from the age of 5, 6, 7. I also know plenty of folks who it doesn't start to quite feel so important until they hit puberty. There was a time when I was working with adolescents more directly in my therapy work. And there was a particular adolescent I was working with who kind of started to develop similar eating disorder symptoms that I had. And it was around the age I was when I had gotten my eating disorder because they were starting to go through puberty and their chest was starting to grow and their hips were starting to change. And they really did not and they knew they were trans, but as their body started changing, they got more and more gender dysphoria. They got more and more distraught in their own body. And so they had learned that by restricting their food intake, they could kind of prevent some of those changes from happening. But it was like in a very maladaptive way. And that was actually a big piece of my own eating disorder was being like, I'm not comfortable with how my body is changing. I thought I was just kind of like one of the boys. I'm understanding now that as I hit puberty, I'm being feminized, like seen as like more feminine, and it's sort of femininity is being projected onto me in new ways. I'm being sexualized in new ways. My body is changing in ways that are super uncomfortable. And it's also creating a lot of what at the time I didn't know, but in retrospect, understand as gender dysphoria and a lot of distressing experiences about how felt like watching my body change in a direction that wasn't comfortable and didn't really make sense to me based on what I knew about myself. Trans and gender nonconforming people are 6 times more likely to be autistic, and that comes from a couple different studies, actually. There was a study in 2017 of over 500,000 people, autistic and allistic alike, and they found through that study that like 24% of like the gender diverse population reported being autistic, whereas 5% of the cisgender population in that study reported being autistic. And there's been multiple studies that have come out since then. So there's like a 2022 study, and in that study, 11% of the trans folks that reported had autism. And just in my own life, most trans people that I know, and I know a lot of them, are neurodivergent in some way, shape, or form. It's something that's much more newly being studied, and so studies are still coming out about it. We don't fully understand what's happening. I have some of my own theories that I'll share shortly with you about what might be going on here. But statistically, gender stuff goes on for us, and it's kind of weird. Also, it's important to note that 1 in 3 autistic people, I forget which this study was, but I'm going to link it in the PDF doc as well. 1 in 3 autistic people also report having their gender identity questioned due to their autism diagnosis. So again, this is a way that ableism can kind of play in and make it even more difficult for folks to receive gender affirming care, for folks to be like heard and seen in their own like self-identification and their own, have a sense of their own self-determination. I know for me with some of the gender stuff, basically with my hospitalization when I was younger, it brought on a whole onslaught of other things. Like they were like, you have anorexia, you have like major depression that you're like resistant, like it seems like is resistant to treatment. You have anxiety. At one point we thought I had OCD. At one point I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I also got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Turns out mostly it was just autism and not enough environmental support. That came out in a lot of other ways. But because of all of the ways that I was pathologized as well, even throughout high school, I presented in my gender in many different ways. I went through many phases. I had really short haircuts and I kind of just like dressed like my brother for a period. I kind of grew my hair out really long and dressed a bit more feminine for periods. I was always kind of trying stuff on, but whenever I would kind of try to talk about it with people, there was just a way that like, especially in my family, I was just kind of always seen as the one who was like, just like weird. So it wasn't really taken super seriously, even when I probably would have thrived a bit more with more opportunity to explore gender a bit differently out from underneath like the shame that my own family held around it. Meaning also that like, you know, my mom would say things to me before we'd go places like, is that what you're going to wear? You know, you have to go change, like, you know, just kind of discouraging certain behaviors and encouraging other ones. A really cool thing is that because of this sort of phenomena of a lot of us who are in community also having conversation about these things, and a lot of us being like, isn't it weird how it seems like our gender stuff is kind of connected to our neurodivergence stuff? And a lot of us kind of all just agreeing about that. The community itself has come up with different terms that can be kind of useful and also kind of cool. One of them is autogender, which basically just means that it's a way of expressing the ways that gender and neurotype, or like especially specifically gender and autism, are inextricably linked, meaning that like for me, I don't even know what identifier I use for my gender because I don't. Trans masc is a way to describe someone who takes HRT and takes testosterone and who presents more masculine and supposedly feels more masculine, but I don't necessarily feel masculine, and I don't really understand what it means to feel masculine. I also don't really understand what it means to feel feminine. I just know that I took hormones to feel better about what my body looked like in the world, and that felt good. So I kept doing it, and I like what I see in the mirror. But in terms of the gender piece of it, I just don't really understand gender, if I'm being fully honest, because it all just feels like kind of fake. But and I've talked to other autistic people that feel that way. Not all of us do, but there's a way that then for me, my transness kind of becomes inextricably linked for my neurotype, because I also believe that my neurotype is the thing informing how I interact with the world and with the idea of gender anyway. Anyway, very long tangent. Another word that people use is neuroqueer, and that has more to do with sexuality and identity around sexuality and being neurodivergent, and how that also can impact how we relate to our sense of sexuality. as individuals. So these are sort of like terms that have come about in the last, I don't know, like decade or so. So again, I guess I'd encourage you to really think about kind of like, as parents, like your side of the street, if that makes sense. Meaning, like, think about what are the gender norms that show up in your family. What do they look like? How do they play out? What are the things that your child is growing up around, like regularly seeing? I think an important thing to consider with some of this is that obviously there's a lot of things that are cultural that come into play, whether that's like where you are in the United States, what your cultural background as a family looks like. Maybe there are certain aspects of gender that are quite important to your family. So how do you talk about those? And also think about considering how you relate to your own sense of gender. If you're a cisgender person, do you think about gender? How do you think about gender? How do you know you're a woman? How do you know you're a man? Does that feel right to you? Just starting to kind of unpack those things a little bit in your own life can be kind of meaningful, because I find that a lot of times cisgender people don't have to think about those things. So when they're even trying to approach these conversations with trans folks or folks that are curious about their own gender, there's not a lot that they're necessarily always bringing to the table in that regard. The other thing I would recommend is educating yourself, and again, just more self-reflection. So again, maybe looking into resources. This is specifically if you find that your child might be expressing some level of gender diversity or an interest in exploring it more, or even just expressing their gender a bit differently. There are a lot of resources out there written by trans people for educational purposes to allow you to connect to this type of information. I would also think about providing opportunities to explore different gendered opportunities. I don't know why I put quotes there, but oh, gendered, I didn't finish the quotes. Meaning that playing with dolls, right? Playing with trucks, like it's a very rudimentary sort of space to go from, but I think it's important to not necessarily limit the child based on your own expectation of them, but to give them the option, right? Do you want this or do you want this? Here's, maybe 2 options for a younger person and maybe 5 options for an older person, right? But opportunity. Providing space for experimentation, not just allowing it, but maybe you're going clothes shopping with your kid at the beginning of the year. Shop in any section you want. I mean, okay, so my experience was we went to the department store. We went to like Sears or whatever. And there's like a girls section and a boys section. And I would always want to shop in the boys section because I was like, they have cargo shorts over there and those are cool. And my mom would literally be like, no, you can't shop in the boys section. That's weird. You're a girl. So I was always just inherently limited to one section of the clothing store and didn't even have an opportunity to go look at what else was available to me or decide if I wanted something different. And then I would also say listen and support, like one of the biggest things for any child, but especially a child who we would consider disabled or just a child who's autistic, whether or not the disability label fits. Self-determination is not something that's afforded to people very often when it comes to disability stuff. And when it is, I find that, again, it's quite limited. Being able to take your child's lead and really think about what they're bringing to you, noticing, again, shifts and changes, your child best. So noticing if there's shifts and changes with how, again, they're presenting, the things that they're showing interest in, the things that they're bringing to you, the things that I know parents sometimes overhear what kids are talking to their friends about. So if you're overhearing, there's a shift in that as well, right? Really thinking about that and really trying to plug in a way that is not like overly intrusive, if that makes sense. I'm noticing the time, and I just want to do a quick check-in with folks in the chat if folks feel able to check in. We can either I can go back over some different information and I can cover a little bit more of kind of like my story and some of the things that I specifically struggled with. Although my story is a bit different again in that I didn't have a diagnosis earlier in my life. So we can do some of that. I can also actually just start opening it up for Q&A if folks have questions that they're sitting with that they want to have a bit more of a conversation about. I don't have a whole lot more slides for us because there weren't that as many questions in the chat as I was thinking there might be throughout the presentation. So if folks want to take a second and chime in, I'm open to hearing from the room. I'll probably do a little bit of everything. Like I'll probably share a little bit more of my story and we can kind of we can go over a few slides and then I'm going to open it up as well anyway, but before I make the executive decision. Someone asked, when was your diagnosis under DSM-4 or DSM-5? My diagnosis was, what year is it? What happened? Where am I? It's 2024. My diagnosis was, I believe, in 2016 or 2017, and I'm 33 now. So I was like in my youngish 20s when I got my diagnosis. And again, that was after really about a decade and a half of really intense mental health struggle. And in a lot of ways, I think that because I was not really supported with a lot of this stuff, and I had a lot of like social trauma that came up for me over the span of my teenage years, it also got kind of complicated by like CPTSD, which is something that I also struggle with. So it was kind of it was probably like a 5-year process to my diagnosis where I was seeing one therapist specifically, and she just happened to work with a lot of autistic folks and neurodivergent folks. And we happened to be doing a bunch of trauma work, doing EMDR therapy, and it wasn't something about it like wasn't working, and we kept trying to figure out why. And I kept getting stuck on like similar things in therapy. And basically at one point she was like, oh, I think we've missed that like you might be on the spectrum. So then I went through like a whole other process of working with like another clinician and then getting tested for it. So it was like a very long, kind of muddy process of trying to work my way to the diagnosis. And then it was a lot of like kind of like going back through my entire life and trying to re-understand it through that lens, which was both very affirming, but also brought up a lot of grief because it helped me understand all the ways that like, had we maybe known, there might have been more or different supports in place for me. And one of the things I also really struggled with was like, when I became an independent adult and I went off to school, my like daily living stuff like completely tanked. Like I wasn't able to like brush my teeth. I wasn't able to take showers regularly. Like my hair got so ratty, I had to like get it cut. Like I wasn't doing well taking care of myself. And I also wasn't doing well with relationships with other people. And I was isolating a lot. So there were like a bunch of kind of big things that came up where it was like, something's off, like what's happening? That sort of got me to that space, diagnosis wise. I'll be honest, I don't really fully know which DSM the clinician was working under. We didn't really talk about kind of all of those details at the time. It was, it was very difficult also to find someone who would test an adult. When I finally found a testing center, they kind of just like walked me through it. And then they were like, yeah, like this makes sense. And at the time they were like, it's kind of fitting more of like an Asperger's profile, but we don't use the Asperger's label in the community. Well, I don't, or at least the people I'm in community with don't have private health. I have Medicaid, which is a whole other conversation because it's free for me, which is very helpful in my life, but it's not good when it comes to continuity of care or getting disability services necessarily. And I see a lot of health specialists because of my co-occurring health things that have to do with my neurodivergence, like yeah, I have like hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos and stuff like that. So it's, yeah, health insurance is another piece to consider with some of this stuff, of course, as well with your family. Yeah, so one of the things I want to actually kind of revisit as well, if I can, let me see if I can figure out how to pull this up here. Sorry, I'm navigating multiple pieces of technology. Oops, there yet. So I do want to also, thanks for the tip on the HCBS waiver. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good and supported now. It's taken a lot of my own personal efforts, but even just being connected with the Nest program and the different ways that I've seen them supporting folks and like being able to be in community and working as like a self advocate slash like someone who's in these conversations is meaningful for me, which is really great. I've done a lot of really great trauma healing, and now I get to apply that to my work, which is really cool, and working with other people. But I wanted to pull up this slide as well for folks because I wanted to check in and I wanted to see if anyone had specific questions about like things that you're dealing with your child, things that you're struggling to talk with your child about, anything that your family might be going through. I want to kind of open up this last like 30 minutes or so for some more specific Q&A if folks have that. I know it's kind of towards the end of the school year. I know y'all have kind of been doing this all year. I know it's also a little bit difficult when we're just operating off of a chat function, but my goal is really just to be here for y'all. I didn't want to go too deep into the woods with the detail of all of this. So yeah, I just want to kind of like open up the space to if there's anything specific that y'all are hoping for support with. And also, yeah, thanks for the Access VR suggestion as well. I appreciate that.
And it looks like there's 2 questions in the Q&A also.
Oh, where do I access that? Oh, beautiful. Okay. Oh, cool.
So, yeah.
I'm so glad you said that because I would not have even seen that. Okay, so my 16-year-old kiddo states he likes only girls, but constantly jokes with male best friends about same-sexual romantic responses. I've always accepted him in whatever his sexual preference is, but wonder if he is just joking and mimicking his friend who claims also to prefer girls, but also enjoying same-sex talking with my kiddo. That's a tricky one because I also think like, you know, for me growing up, and even, I mean, there was so much of like the no homo and the kind of like funny stuff where it's like people are sort of, I find that a lot of teens are testing limits a lot of the time. So your kiddo, he might be interested in more than girls, but he also might not be in like ready to have that conversation. He might not even fully necessarily be ready to kind of like accept that in himself. For me growing up, I never claimed like a sexual identity really. I just always was bringing boys home or girls home. Like I was always just crushing on everybody. And the one thing I got lucky with in my family because they're so avoidant is no one ever really asked me. They always kind of assumed I was straight, but at the same time, sometimes I'd be like, this is my girlfriend. Like, and my mom would be like, all right. You know, she's like, I'm not going to ask. But at the end of the day, for a lot of my like teenage years, even though I knew I was attracted to lots of different people and I never explicitly was like, I'm straight or I'm gay, I still kind of allowed people to think that I was straight or to kind of project that onto me because it was what was most comfortable. And because I also knew that there was a sense of social stigma around being gay, being queer. So I would say like, you know, it's great that you're noticing that this is going on with your kiddo. It's great that you're thinking about it. It could be a possibility that he or his friend maybe like more than girls, but it also might be a possibility that they're just kind of testing limits with each other, hopefully in a way that feels safe for both of them. And I would say this might be a situation where you kind of wait it out and again, let him kind of come to you or you wait to maybe get a little more information. Could just be teenage playfulness, could be kind of like the no homo thing, but it could also be, could be more. I hope that was helpful. Can you talk more about gauging trustworthiness for small kids? Yeah, I will say, I'm sorry if you are hearing that siren. Um, I will say that this is not necessarily something that I have like a whole lot of training in. Like, I don't necessarily tend to work with anyone that's like really 10 or under. So it's definitely not in terms of my like professional training, something that I have a whole lot of proficiency in. But maybe what could be helpful for you and your family is thinking about maybe using social stories or even using the structure that you already have in place to understand like how do we know like who is trustworthy, right? We have, maybe mom, dad, sibling, if we're talking sort of nuclear family and understanding, well, what are some things that these people do that help us know that we can depend on them, that help us know that we can rely on them? What are ways that we might feel when we're around someone that we know is safe? It might start with a conversation around safety, engaging safety. And then from there, trustworthiness, which is a little bit more of a complicated topic, can maybe, I would say, be built on top of that building block of safety. I'm going to go ahead and actually just bump up here so y'all can get my email as well. I can also see if I can find some more resources about that conversation that I can put on the PDF for you as well, because there were a few that I was looking at that were pretty good for a lot of different age ranges, and I'll see if I can find something. I'm seeing there's a few questions in the chat and some more Q&A, so I'm going to keep working through the Q&A and we'll go from there. How to help support the desire for friendship and increase social connection, but also the challenges and anxiety around struggling with the same for a 16-year-old boy. That's really tough. So the thing that I've struggled with the most is just in general, I think my nervous system is just like, we have a lot of anxiety. Like my base level is just a lot of anxiety. So depending on a lot of different factors in my day, my social anxiety can really spike. I actually work in nightlife settings, which is kind of ironic because sometimes I'll have a show at night that I'm performing in or something. And literally depending on like if I slept well, if I ate appropriately that day, like if I had enough water, if there's like something else emotional going on in my life, that can determine whether or not I'm like dreading going to work and feeling extremely socially anxious, or if I'm feeling kind of more rooted and grounded in myself and able to go. And the funny thing is that I'm not really a different person from one event to the next, but it feels completely different from one event to the next for me. The thing that I've found to be most helpful for me is really learning how to settle down my anxiety somatically, because if I can't do that, if I'm operating from an anxious place, I'm not able to tap into parts of me that can access confidence, can access joy, can access connection. And that's a bigger conversation maybe about a framework that I use with my clients called internal family systems. And that's about the different parts of us that show up. But what I would recommend to you is start maybe some conversations around how do you feel rooted and grounded in yourself? How do you just on a day-to-day basis feel confident in yourself? Because one of the things that has helped me when I'm going into a social situation is trying to shift my thinking away from who's going to be there? What are they going to want to talk about? How am I going to have to talk about it with them? Should I be social scripting right now? What are the conversations I want to have? If someone asks me about this, what am I going to say? What's the environment going to be like? Is there going to be a lot of overlapping sounds? Where's the bathroom going to be? Like, can I look up the venue online and see what it's going to look like? Which is all the stuff going through my head. I find that it's very easy for me to get stuck on that stuff. But sometimes when I can bring myself back to a conversation with myself that sounds more like, if I don't like the environment, I can go home. If I don't like the environment and I need to go home, I have a way to get myself there and a way to get out. I have a social script for letting someone know that I have to leave. I've practiced that with myself. I kind of return myself to, I can take this risk and I can put myself out there, and I have the skills and the tools to get myself out of a situation that doesn't feel comfortable. And for me, that has been something that's helped me build a sense of safety within myself enough to allow myself to take chances and to trust myself to get myself out of a situation where I am not, where it's not enjoyable or it's not feasible for me because I'm too overwhelmed sensorially. I would check in with your child about what are the things that make them anxious. Are they anxious about how others will treat them? Is it some of the things I named that like they're not going to know what the conversational topic is and they're not going to necessarily feel equipped to jump in? Is it that they're not sure what the environment's going to look like? And some of those things you can try to work with them to mitigate, right? Like have the friend over to our house if it's a more comfortable space. Go to a space you've already been in. Try to connect with people that have similar interests to you. You can kind of, I think, gauge it based on your individual child, but I do find that trying to root into myself and having a practice of that, even if it doesn't go perfectly, and even if social situations can still be awkward and throw me off and anxiety can spike, can be something that can be a really great practice. This is a very similar Ezekiel, your second question is a very similar one. I think that I kind of already spoke to, but any ideas or experience around struggling with negative thinking, catastrophizing things, feeling like nothing's ever good or good enough. And I'm here to tell you that that's my entire life. That's my entire life. And it's made it very hard because I naturally filter the world through, I'm looking at the details and I'm kind of looking at what could go wrong. And I'm trying to always plan to have a sense of some level of control or knowing what to expect, because when I'm in a moment where I'm overwhelmed, I don't feel that I can always trust myself to get through it. That's another one where it's for me been a really long standing and a continuous and regular practice of noticing when that's happening, noticing when I'm getting stuck, or having someone close to me notice and be like, honey, you seem kind of stuck on this, like what's going on for you? And being able to kind of like separate myself out from that a little bit and be like, okay, I'm noticing that right now it feels like nothing is good. It feels like no matter how, like even for this webinar, I was literally sitting here earlier today being like, it's going to be terrible. It's not going to be good. Here's all the ways it's going to go wrong. I don't know what I'm doing. Like my life is horrible. Like, yeah, I think it's definitely like a bit of an autistic thing, because I've spoken to so many autistic people that do that. Like the rumination piece and the perseveration piece can be a lot, and oftentimes it can tend towards the negative. So I don't know what works for everyone, but I know for me, a practice of noticing it, noticing when it's happening, writing about it or talking about it a bit, can be helpful. But sometimes I have also in my life kind of hurt my relationships because I talk about only that stuff all the time. And then I don't understand why people don't want to hang out with me. And I'm like, oh, it's because I'm always talking about how terrible my life is. So also helping him understand, like, okay, where are appropriate spaces to talk about this? What are appropriate outlets for some of this? And also, how can you separate yourself out from the things that you're experiencing internally, because those aren't all of you. Those are just sort of parts of you that are showing up in this moment, even when it kind of feels like, it's all of what's happening. It's not, and you can practice that separation. I hope that was helpful. And Poe, I'm seeing your question, but I'm going to keep working through the Q&A for a second, and then I'm going to come over to the webinar chat for questions. I think there's two more in the Q&A. One person said, my son came to me a few weeks ago because he has been called gay multiple times and asked me if he is gay. I asked him if he has attractions to boys or girls, and he said neither. He's not old enough to date anyway. He is in the 10 and under age group. Yeah, I mean, and I think that like that's super valid as well, is that like there are also plenty of autistic people that are demisexual, so they don't want a sexual relationship with someone that they don't already know and have an emotional connection to. I know plenty of autistic people who are asexual, who are like, yeah, I don't really connect with my sexuality a whole lot, or I don't really feel a need to have sex, or I don't really feel aroused. Like it's just not an experience that I have. So again, this child sounds young, 10 and under, so it's very likely that there's not an attraction to either. And I would say the answer to him in terms of him asking if he's gay is to just kind of be like, that's to be seen, I guess, right? It's up to you to kind of determine how you feel about that and whether or not you think you are. And if now's not the time, now's not the time. And then, of course, it sounds like he probably needs some support around like understanding why someone would say something like that, which unfortunately is how kids act. So supporting him around understanding also like how and why other kids might be mean in that capacity, and helping him really understand like some of the social dynamics of that piece might hopefully be a bit soothing to him in some capacity. It's great that you asked him. It's great that you checked in with him about it. It's great that he felt that he could come to you and share that with you. So I think there's a lot of things in this scenario that are in place that are already really positive. And it might just be a matter of letting him get older and kind of figure it out for himself and continuing this dialogue with him as much as you can. Oh, thanks for the thanks and chat section. Let me check the time here. Okay, we're doing okay. All right, we got one more in the Q&A, and then I'll answer some of the stuff in the chat. And you added it to the Q&A. Thank you. Appreciate it. I initially typed it in the chat, but son is 8 years old. Been working on these building blocks with him since he was around 2 or 3, and we still talk about these things. He thinks in very black and white terms, and I find he needs to have every possible example imagined discussed. Same. How do I help him understand what's okay and not okay overall in general? I'm the same type of way. Like when my partner and I, again, we were talking about this webinar, and I was like, well, here's like 10 different scenarios that could happen. And my partner was like, you are spending so much time on all of these different extremely specific scenarios. And my partner was like, actually, probably none of those are going to happen. And I was like, you don't understand. I have to play out every single scenario because I have to have a plan and I have to know how I'm going to deal with them. And honestly, I think that a lot of that is actually like kind of like the trauma of being autistic in the world and living in a world that is very unpredictable. As soon as we walk out the door, it's extremely unpredictable. And it takes a lot of energy for a lot of autists to like react to that because we're constantly taking in so much information all the time. So one of the things that I think, and this is just one of my own kind of wacky theories, but I've talked to some other people about it that think it might be real. Is that the black and white thinking just helps us narrow down the scope of the things that we need to pay attention to, because if we don't narrow down that scope of things we need to pay attention to, there's too much to have to consider and it becomes extremely overwhelming. My black and white thinking has been a big limitation in my life because I very much have wanted romantic partnership and I've wanted long-lasting community, but it's really gotten in the way of my relationships over time. So my practice around that is trying to get more comfortable emotionally with not knowing. So it might be a practice to work with this child in just kind of noticing when they're wanting to run through every single scenario, checking in and saying like, okay, like, and checking in about like, okay, is it helping right now to run through every single scenario? If we can't run through every single scenario, what does that feel like? What comes up for you? It might be that a lot of anxiety comes up. Okay, so rather than necessarily having to run through every scenario, can we actually get down to that anxiety? Can we figure out how to support that anxiety? Is the need to run through every possible imaginable scenario in order to fully understand what to do in any moment? Is that because they can't, necessarily like sort of, they don't feel that they can trust themselves with it? Like I would just want to understand the why and like why they need to run through everything. And then in terms of kind of the understanding the okay and not okay piece of it, I think that also tends to boil down to helping them check in with how they feel in a moment. One of the ways that I learned was that like when I was younger, I think I experienced a lot of things that felt uncomfortable in the moment, but uncomfortable was just like my day-to-day life. So I was like, well, I always feel uncomfortable. So like if this thing's uncomfortable, what's different? You know what I mean? And it took me a lot of time in my life to start to understand, oh, I feel this way in my body when something is happening that is like setting off an alarm for me, and having to really get clear on that. Because yeah, the other thing that a lot of autistic folks can struggle with, and maybe your son struggles with this too, or maybe not, is proprioception, or what's the word for like struggling to identify the feelings in your body. It's something that I've spent a decade trying to learn.
Interoception, right?
Interoception, that's right. Proprioception is the interoception. That's right. Thank you. So if that's also something that they struggle with, kind of again building out that skill, because the what's okay and what's not okay is so situational, and it's something that as your child gets older, they're going to have to determine that for themselves on a case-by-case basis, because that's kind of how life works. And some of that could mean they do limit their environment a bit more, or you perhaps keep their environment not limited, but like you think about how and where you're kind of talking about the okay and not okay discussion. And I guess I'd also be curious if there are specific things that you've struggled with in this category. At the end of the day, I guess I would recommend with the okay and not okay, also really getting specific on like the things that are like dangerous, not okay, right? Like someone touching you sexually in a way that does not feel comfortable, or someone getting you alone in a way that is not comfortable. Someone emotionally treating you in a way that is not okay, whether it's bullying or some type of emotional manipulation. So there's the kind of the unsafe things. or even just walking home alone at night, whatever it might be in your family. Really like defining those things and then getting clear in your own mind, your own family, what is okay and not okay in other types of social situations, and trying to work that nuance out the older that they get, right? Like that could come down to like okay and not okay being like, am I okay being a bystander in a situation where someone else is being bullied? Um, yeah, it's sorry that I feel like I'm fumbling a little bit only because it's a difficult question to ask without me having or answer without me having a bit more information about the specifics of the family and kind of like the profile of your child, but I hope that that was like moderately helpful. Um, I think there were maybe some other questions in the chat. Okay. So got the one about the so yeah, the question about how to get the child to the self-actualization step. I guess I'm wondering why that feels important to you. Um, because self-actualization is something that we are doing throughout our lives. It's something that we are regularly doing as we grow and as we discover the world and as we learn about the world. We're also kind of learning about ourselves and figuring out who we want to be in the world in many different ways. Um, for self-maintenance. When you say self-maintenance, do you mean like self-care tasks, like sort of like hygiene, like kind of taking care of the day-to-day stuff, um, and being a bit more independent? Is that kind of what you're saying? Day-to-day school, job, et cetera. Yeah, yeah. Okay, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I understand. Also, I might need to plug my computer in a moment here, but let's see what we can do. Yeah, I would say, I mean, the independence piece, I guess it depends because again, I don't really know like your child's like sensory profile necessarily. I don't necessarily know like the things specifically that they're struggling with. Um, one of the things that my family was really big on was routine. So, you know, like when I got up for school, the idea was you get out of bed, you come downstairs, you eat breakfast. After breakfast, you go upstairs, you get dressed for school, brush your teeth, wash your face, come back downstairs, lunches are packed. You leave the door, you walk to the bus on the corner, you go to school. You come home from school, you unpack your book bag, you start doing your homework, you have your snack. Family dinner is probably sometime between 5:36 or 7, and then we probably have some kind of sports practice after that, or we're finishing our homework. The school days were like very routine. So in a way, it made it easy for me to do that stuff because it was happening every day at the same times, more or less. And my family, my mom specifically, was typically being like, you have to go do this thing. Unfortunately, when I moved out of my parents' house, because it was always just my mom telling me to do it, and I wasn't always like given a lot of option, I really kind of didn't do any of it. Like that routine was no longer built into my day to day for me. And I wasn't really incentivized when I was younger to kind of do those things for myself because it was just something that was sort of always like automated in my life. That kind of actually made me really struggle because I never really learned to care about those things outside of knowing that my mom cared about them. And if I didn't do them, she'd be upset with me, or the next step of the day couldn't happen. So, as much as I wish that that had sort of translated into my daily life, it just didn't. So I would say maybe trying to have a mix of a little bit of routine in your family's life, but also trying to figure out what kind of routine might work for your kiddo, trying to find out about the things that motivate them towards like, why might you want to brush your teeth? If it's a really awful sensory experience to brush your teeth, like I don't like minty toothpaste. That's like a huge turn off to me. I really don't like the sensation of brushing my teeth. So it's not something I really enjoy doing if I don't have to. As I got older, my teeth and my gums started suffering, and I was like, I guess I have to. And the thing that got me to start caring about it was my health suffering. And the idea is hopefully to get them to care about it before that happens. But it's tricky sometimes because for me, if something's not actually right in front of me, it's hard for me to think about like a potential consequence sometimes, depending. But when it comes to a sensory thing like that, it's difficult. So trying to help them figure out maybe if it's a thing for them too, where they don't like minty toothpaste, all right, what options do we have? What accommodations can we make? Helping them understand why these things might matter, not just to you, but could matter to them. Why having a bit more independence, why being able to kind of maintain themselves, their sense of schedule, the things they need to do could be important in the future. Maybe what might be motivating to them is understanding that they can live independently eventually and that by the time they get to a place of living independently, having some of these things figured out could be important. That might be a motivator for them. It might not. It might be a motivator right now that if they brush their teeth, their breath won't smell. I don't know what it's going to be for your child, but I would say try to tap into some of those things. Try to tap into things that might be meaningful for them. I hope that was helpful.
And yeah, I just wanted to say we have, I think, just time for one more question, which I think there's one in the chat that was unanswered, and then we can wrap up.
Which one in the
I
chat
think
was
did we
unanswered?
I think it's the last one.
Y'all
My
did, oh, I'm so
did-
sorry. Do you mean the Q&A?
oh, sorry, in the Q&A. Sorry, yes, that's right. I get the two of them.
Yeah, give me one
next.
second. Yes, I'm going to take literally 2 seconds to plug my computer in just to make sure it doesn't die on everyone. And then I'm going to answer this question and then we can wrap. I read the question. So my son has no friends, but he is desperate to make friends. The problem is that he is so anxious about it. He ends up either being mean to people or too familiar with people they're instantly turned off by him. How can I help him? I'm going to get my computer charger and then I'm going to come back with some thoughts. Be right back.
Sure. And as we were waiting, I wanted to actually also refer to the question on routines and self-maintenance. We also encourage you to go back and watch the recording that's on the NYU website on how to build routines at home. That can be really helpful in terms of really what
Okay.
everything Honey was talking about, basically.
Oh, what did I miss?
Oh, I was just saying, like, we had a webinar on building routines at home, and I was just saying that it really aligned with everything that you were saying, and they can go back and watch that recording as well.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, anonymous attendee, this is a difficult one, right? Because it sounds like there's something happening for him where in the moment it's difficult for him to kind of regulate himself, and or there's something happening where he is socializing in ways that are not helping to bridge that gap to build those friendships, right? And that's where I'm like, yeah, I have questions about, like, generally speaking, how does he do with like kind of self-regulation in the moment? I'd be really curious about why these are the two directions that he goes with things. What I understand about people of all neurotypes is that we don't do things for no reason. Everything that we do it for a reason. Even in terms of addiction, people stay addicted to things because it does something for them. People are mean to people because it does something for them. It protects them, right? Or whatever it might be. People are overly familiar because it does something for them. So I'd be really curious, and it might be useful for you to get curious about what do these two behaviors do for him? Why is he being mean in the moment? Like, what is that about? Is it because something upsets him and he struggles to kind of regulate that in the moment and it comes out a little bit sideways? Is it because he's scared? Is it because, yeah, I would get really curious about what's underneath that. And with the overly familiar piece as well, I'd be really curious about what's happening there. Is he aware that he's being overly familiar with people? If he's not, how do y'all talk about that together? Can you use some social stories to help him understand what's like familiar enough, but like not overly familiar? Maybe also helping him with some scripts. Social scripts have been really helpful for me. The amount of times that I go over in my head just obsessively, like I'll just have conversations with other people in my head like super regularly. If I'm, whether or not I'm planning something with them sometimes, but also like if I'm planning a phone call or something with someone, depending on my level of comfort with them, I'm probably scripting at least a little bit. So I would maybe think of like, okay, like if you're hanging out with someone new, what are like maybe 4 or 5 topics that could be really great to talk about? If they bring up a topic that isn't one of those topics, how do you want to respond? And really just trying to help set him up, not in a way that's super rigid necessarily, but in a way where he has kind of things to lean on that could give him options other than kind of maybe lashing out or being a bit more mean or leaning into a space that feels a bit too familiar. Again, I wish we could talk more directly about it. I hope that was at least moderately helpful. It's 7:27, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. And I've been talking at you for quite a while. And it's only Tuesday, so we all have quite a week to get through. But I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate your questions, and you're always welcome to email me or reach out. I'm happy to offer consultation sessions. Happy to kind of just correspond over email if you have more questions or more you want to say about one of the questions you asked. If you have more questions about that. Looks like we've got an evaluation link in the webinar chat, and I'm gonna follow up with a PDF of like resources and other things that I discussed here so that you can have some of those available to you as well. And I just want to thank Nest Program for having me tonight as well.
Thank you so much. I personally need some processing time to really,
We talked about a lot.
informative and amazing and incredible presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. As everyone's also thanking you in the chat, we want to also thank you for sharing and such incredible information. Thank you.
Yes, I
Yeah,
just want to echo that. This was tremendously informative, and I really appreciate like how you think, like how you presented this information and considerations for parents and the self-reflection that we need to be doing. And it was very powerful. So thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thanks y'all.